You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great. Man, right now I am just so impressed with you.
Oh, yeah? Why today? Because I know there's so many reasons.
I mean, you are just, we've talked about this so many times on the podcast about you being so good with gadgets and doodads, but I mean, the level you've taken the podcast to in terms of audio quality and the ability to, bring a guest on and kind of walk them through, regardless of what setup of technology they have, you're able to troubleshoot it on the fly. I mean, I think you could do podcasting for a living.
Well, we would have to, run ads, have sponsors, all stuff that we haven't historically done. I mean, you never know in the future, but I like to think of this as a safe place. But thank you for that. I am definitely a device nerd, and I certainly have tried to up the quality of my poor voice, at least, from a product perspective, right, as this podcast is. It really is a labor of love. I think, I enjoy doing it, learned something new, neither of us knew what we were doing when we started this 94 episodes ago, way back in July of 2019, but here we are.
And we were recording on Zoom. But I just do have to reveal to everybody that we gave a presentation together yesterday, and then at the end of the presentation, you pushed a little laugh track button, and that was quite the way to end a presentation.
I think I'm looking always for ways to leverage my Rode Procaster, which is one of the devices that I've been using here for the last few episodes, you can use it for Zoom, you can use it for Teams meetings. I think it's a memorable thing if you've got, a laugh track or, a sad trombone or, something else, that might be out there that people might want to listen to. So why not, right?
I think you should start integrating it into the show more. I mean, it plays well.
I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at it right now and I'm tempted to hit one of the buttons. I just don't know if we're ready for that. I don't think we've achieved our final form, right? We could be doing a lot more. I think, we have a new platform that we're using for recording that hopefully people have been able to tell the last few weeks. The audio quality has gotten a lot better. There's potential for, more guests, not, from a number perspective, having, 3, 4, 5 people, on shows, but also guest audience, right? Being able to participate as far as, listening to these things as they get recorded and maybe catching some of the nuances that don't make the final edit. For the record, I think most people, when they're listening to the podcast out there, what you hear in the podcast is 99% the way it occurred in real life. It's very little editing other than maybe cleaning out, some gaps in between where we're just, making sure we're not stepping on each other, or audio quality things, or maybe the occasional flub. But you'll hear the ums, the ahs, right? All the things of a natural conversation. I think that's kind of the style that we've approached. But, maybe at some point we'll open up to testing out how a live audience member might be able to interact with the show, ask questions of our guests or, any of us, and kind of as we're going along. I think, from an ego perspective, I would hate to put it out there and then no one shows up or like one person. And so I think we, as we continue to build the audience, maybe that's an option we'll explore in the future.
Jeff, we always put it out to the audience. We're so open to feedback. That live audience concept is one of the things that we've talked about doing. Another one is video-based podcasts. And so, with the platform that we're on, I think it's certainly something that we could do. But it's definitely an additional investment of our time. So we'd like to hear back from the audience. Is that something that, you would look for the podcast on a platform that included video? Would video make it more exciting for you?
It would certainly make it more exciting for me, but I don't know if that's a good exciting. I mean, we have faces for podcasts, which is probably a good thing, and maybe voices for a silent movie, but we're making it work.
There you go.
We probably want to talk some identity, but before we get to that, any notes or things that you want to bring up before we introduce our guest today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had Andrew Shikiar on our podcast a ways back now, but he was from the FIDO organization. Well, they've got their annual conference called Authenticate 2021, which is coming up in October. But they currently have a call for speakers out. It's fast approaching. The deadline for that is May 31, which I think is 1 week from the time this episode will air. We'll have the link to the call for speakers in the show notes. So if you're interested in potentially presenting at that conference, it's in person in Seattle, and it would be a great way to kind of build your presence within the IAM industry.
Yeah, plus meet other people in the identity space. Seattle's a great town too. I've been there once, I think, or maybe twice, and I've enjoyed every minute out there. It's definitely different from other cities, at least in the U.S. that I've been to.
Well, it's at that, I think it's called the Motif Hotel, which I think is the same place that you and I went to the Cup and Jerk Hole conference in Seattle. So it's walking distance to the first Starbucks. It's walking distance to that fish market that they have in Seattle. I can't.
Pike's Place.
Yeah, Pike Place. Yeah, so exactly. Yeah, really cool little spot.
Yeah, definitely recommended. So, like Jim said, we'll have a link in our show notes so people will check out Authenticate Con later this year. So why don't we get on to some identity talk, because I'm excited to introduce our next guest to the show. His name is Bala Kumar. He is the Chief Product Officer at Jumio, and we're inviting him on here to talk conversation around identity and identity verification specifically. So welcome to the show, Bala.
Jeff, Jim, great to be on. Thank you for having me, and I hope everyone is staying well and healthy. I've been a fan of your podcast, and I've been checking out a few of the episodes in the recent past.
Well, thank you so much for that. And yes, before I get too farther, today is a momentous day in my household. My wife and I are both past the 2-week mark of our last vaccine shot. So we're going out to eat actually tonight for the first time in over a year. So it is very exciting times here. We have a very nice sushi dinner lined up, and that is something to get there. But thank you so much, Bala, for joining us. I think one of the things that we like to do when we have a guest on is to talk a little bit briefly about their background. So I'm curious, from your perspective and your journey in the identity space, how did you get into identity verification? Is the identity space something that you chose, or did you choose it?
Well, first off, I've been a product guy most of my life. I spent the majority of my career at TransUnion, the credit bureau, before joining Jumio. My move to the identity space was happenstance. One of my colleagues took up a different role in the organization. My boss at the time, amazing guy, Jeff Brown, he asked me if I could step into the role and help out. I've always been ready for a new challenge, and I said, sure, why not? And it started there with me taking on responsibility for one component of TransUnion's identity solutions over a decade ago. I hit the ball out of the park, and Jeff and the organization started to entrust more responsibilities over time. I was leading the product organization for all of TU's fraud ID solutions in the US market. We made a bunch of acquisitions, including Iovation, one of the leading device risk providers in the marketplace. With that acquisition, I moved to Iovation as the Chief Product Officer. And over the 2 years that I was there, we made some great strides expanding the Iovation suite and also integrating the high-value Iovation capabilities into the broader TransUnion Fraud ID product suite. And then Jumio happened. I loved my time at TransUnion. When the Jumio opportunity came up, it was a tough call. And as I said earlier, I'm always excited for new challenges. So I decided to make the jump, and so glad that I made the call. It's been an amazing time here. The culture, collaboration, customer focus runs in the company's DNA. We're all focused on solving one customer need, which is ensuring high degree trust that the individual has, that you're dealing with, and making sure that they are who they claim to be. On a lighter note, a few years ago, my son, when he was in kindergarten, he asked me what I do at work. I try to explain it many different ways. I try to explain how fraudsters operate, what my team does to stop them. And he goes, so Dad, are you like one of those superheroes? And I said, sure. And I have, of course, not tried to correct that image that he has about me.
He'll figure it out one of these days, right? No, having teenage boys, I kind of know that eventually they become much cooler than you are. And so I have two people who live with me who are much cooler than me. So Bala, in your role as chief product officer, I mean, what would you say you do here? What is a chief product officer? Uh, I've heard that role a million times, but I'm not really clear on what it is.
Yeah, great question. So there are a few things that I'm responsible for. It starts with establishing a vision, driving focus within the organization, keeping it simple, execution of that vision, being the glue in the organization. So to double click on that, in terms of establishing a vision, my primary responsibility is to make sure that we have a very clear product vision and a strategy and a roadmap that goes with it. It is about making sure that we are placing the right bets that will deliver the highest value to our customers. This is not just about another feature that got rolled out or 10 features that got rolled out. If it does not have a meaningful impact on customers, we've just wasted our time. And so it's about placing the right bets, making sure that that's going to deliver impactful value for our customers. On the driving focus piece, this requires ruthless prioritization. It comes with having to say no to more things than I like. Steve Jobs very famously said that it is not just saying no to initiatives that you don't like, but also to some initiatives that you're passionate about to be able to let go. So that way you can truly focus your time and your energy on a few that will make a massive impact. That ultimately is what will ensure customer success and therefore our success as well. So getting that focus, getting that prioritization nailed down is a key part of my responsibility.
I think that mindset's really valuable for an identity and access management program, specifically a program manager, because a lot of times you do need that glue, right? And I do kind of think of a program manager as also a product owner and a product manager sometimes when it comes to prioritization. What are the features, functionality that they're hearing from their customers, whether it's internal or external, whatever it may be, and being able to articulate that and translate that into a product or a service. So I think that's a valuable skill that a lot of folks, maybe don't necessarily overlook, but I think maybe sometimes they undervalue it. And I think, hearing about your experiences, right, and having the passions for IM, and obviously, we all have a passion for IM. I mean, we're on an IM podcast, obviously. So, this isn't, this is very niche from a topic perspective, but we're doing it anyway. And I think that's the kind of thing that helps. And I'm curious, as you're talking with, customers, partners, even competitors or other folks, when you start talking about product development, where do you take your inspiration and your inputs from, and how do you coalesce that into this is a feature or functionality that yes, we're going to go move forward with this, or how do you say no to something that is a great idea but is just either not feasible right now or for other reasons just can't pursue it?
Yeah, I've been around long enough and I've made a bunch of those mistakes where you think, hey, I've got an idea. I think this is going to deliver value for our customers. And you spin a bunch of cycles on it. And then eventually when you take it to market, you realize that you're not getting the traction that you thought you would get. So for me, a big step in the right direction is moving away from those whiteboards and actually getting out and meeting with your customers, having the conversations with your customers, observing how they work, understanding their processes, understanding their workflows. Because when you do that, you will start seeing what their pain points are. Some of these pain points are very obvious for customers and they're like, I wish somebody could help solve this problem. And there are some others that they just don't realize because it's just become second nature. They've been operating in that environment and they just go on clicking through stuff. And as you observe this, you go, I think there could be some more efficiencies that we could bring about here. So spending a lot of time with customers and understanding what their processes look like is a very critical and the most important feedback that any product manager can take back and then get to the drawing board and start figuring out how to design the solution around it. Take that design back to the customer, get their feedback. That continuous iteration is what is necessary for good product development and rollout. There's another aspect of it as well, which is keeping it simple. So I mentioned, setting the vision, prioritizing, but my next job is to also make molehills of mountains. Simplification of complex topics. Folks oftentimes across organizations end up overthinking, overcomplicating, overextending what is required. We start looking at corner cases. My job is to build and mentor a product organization that can help drive the keep it simple mantra.
I like that approach.
The other aspect too, Jeff, as you said, how how do you actually take this to market, right? So execution of the vision. So we really need to stop just talking and brainstorming ideas, but let's actually get it on the ground, right? And as soon as that happens, you'll start getting real-time feedback on whether the direction you headed in is the right direction or if you need to pivot.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know we've been talking a lot about kind of the role of a chief product officer, and we're going to talk here about identity proofing and what Jumio does. I guess, what is identity proofing? Why is it important for enterprises to have this capability as part of their organization and, establishing that trust with customers?
So there are a couple of questions there. One is what ID proofing itself is. So when somebody is out there trying to apply for a credit card or trying to get an insurance policy, if you're in the branch, you can see the person, you can have a conversation with the person, you can check the identity documents and all this other fun stuff and green light them through the process. But if they're coming through a digital channel, you're not seeing the individual, you're missing that personal connection, right? So it is very critical in those channels, call centers, online channels, etc., to be able to verify that the person who's applying for whatever service you're providing is indeed the right person. ID proofing is the process and the tools that enable you to be able to successfully do that. At Jumio, we provide ID proofing capabilities, which is very much centered around government issued IDs or other forms of documentation that you carry. So this could be a driver's license, could be a national ID, could be a US passport or whichever passport of your nationality. To answer the second part of your question on what is critical to help customers trust their customers or trust their end consumers, my friends, of course, know me as the fraud guy. I have to keep reminding them I'm not the fraud guy, I'm the fraud prevention guy. Anyways, recently I had a friend ask me if there's a way to find out if their information has been compromised. I told her, in these times, by default, you should assume your information has been compromised. There is even a Wikipedia page with a chronological list of breaches. You can go online and find sites where you can purchase stolen identities. Some of these sites are beautifully designed. They offer an Amazon-like shopping cart checkout experience to purchase compromised data. You can go in and say you're looking for, a male, 35 years, with a master's, 2 major credit cards, with a credit limit of $10,000. And boom, you'll get results back. You can choose and add it to your cart, and a couple of dollars later, you actually have those identities. It's as simple as that. And fraudsters thrive on these. So in this breach environment, if you're trying to do ID proofing, it is hard to tell if you're dealing with a real individual or if you're dealing with a fraudster using some of that compromised data. There's some controls you can put in place, like device risk solutions. You can check to see velocity, how often has an individual repeatedly come back to the site. But these are band-aids to a massive problem. That's where the document-centric approach comes into play, or the ID-centric approach. So companies like us, Jumio, we provide that ID verification layer that can take a government-issued ID, extract information from it, verify that it actually meets the minimum fraud checks, and then extensive fraud checks that we run on it to make sure that an image is not superimposed, to make sure that they have not messed around with the barcodes on the back of the driver's license and things like that. And also think about this, right? You cannot get on a plane without a government issued ID. That's what TSA looks for before they let you through the line. There's a significant level of trust in these IDs. So by switching from the traditional checks and moving to an ID-centric or a document-centric view brings a much higher degree of confidence in these transactions. Now couple that with a selfie that can be matched against the photo, right? And you now have an excellent fraud deterrent in place. How often do you think a fraudster will be willing to take a selfie of themselves to establish an identity? It would be like saying, say cheese so the cops know what you look like.
Yeah, that's right on. Yeah, I think when I hear about this this topic, I think about taking very much real world processes and bringing them into the digital age. I've helped organizations with their IAM strategy. I mean, that's essentially what Jeff and I have been doing for the past decade. And one of the topics that comes up a lot is levels of assurance. Having a level of assurance framework like the NIST 800-63, where there's various levels of assurance, and you have to be at a certain level, like a level 3 assurance for certain activities. And I kind of see that's where the Jumio solution, or essentially doing the identity proofing, having that, taking the physical world identifier and being able to digitize it so that you can prove you are who you say you are at a much more complex level.
You nailed it, Jim. That's essentially what it is, right? And especially in these COVID times, a lot of businesses are starting to shift to, or not starting to shift, they have shifted to these online channels. They don't have a choice, right? And so it becomes even more critical for them to have good fraud deterrence in place. And so things like the ID scans, the selfie checks, etc., goes a long way in allowing them to establish good confidence and trust that they are interacting with the right individuals.
I know another major use case for this is KYC, or know your customer. And I've seen that a lot in the banking environment. I was in the banking environment prior um, to getting into consulting. And a lot of the focus of KYC, if I remember correctly, was around preventing money laundering. Having that assurance level having that assurance at such a level that people weren't setting up accounts just so that they could launder money through a bank. But maybe you could educate us a little bit more on, what is know your customer, and what are the major use cases that you see surrounding that, and how do they tie back to identity proofing?
So KYC, or know your customer, it's actually spawns across multiple use cases. It starts with account creation, the first time you're trying to establish an account for yourself, but it doesn't stop there. The journey continues into account management as you're trying to make changes to your existing profile. You require it as as the consumers are transacting with your enterprise as well. The key piece, as I mentioned earlier, enterprises are increasingly vulnerable to fraudulent attacks. There's so much compromised information out there. It's very hard for them to keep up. To better protect them, KYC standards or guidelines have been implemented to guard against fraud, like you said, money laundering, drug and terrorist financing, etc. There are some very basic and foundational steps required. Establishing the identity of the consumer that you're working with. What is the nature of their activities? Where are they getting their funds from? How much are they transferring around? Is that a typical behavioral pattern, or are we seeing some anomaly patterns, fraudulent patterns, or risk patterns here? Those are the types of things that KYC and AML solutions essentially are able to surface. A good KYC process is critical for compliance, but also from a risk management standpoint. The requirements of KYC AML programs, though, they can be very overwhelming for enterprises as they're getting more and more stringent, and it takes significant allocation of resources to meet the regulatory requirements. Even after you have it in place, the continuous monitoring, tracking, etc., can be quite burdensome on enterprises. Ultimately, though, it'll help enterprises be less prone to fraudulent attacks, and more importantly, reduce fraud losses. Now note, I said reduce fraud losses because it is not realistic to expect to stop it altogether.
Yeah, I cringe when I hear, eliminate and these superlatives that basically say it will never happen again, right? If you do this one thing. I think really it's about mitigation and remediation and, managing risk and those sorts of things. From a KYC or even from a identity proofing standpoint, are there any best practices that organizations should be following so they know when's the right way or what are the right situations to leverage capabilities in this space, right? If I'm not doing this today, how do I get into this? Like, what are some of the best practices that I should be looking for as I maybe get into this space?
That's a great question. If you're just getting in the space, you want to make sure that you're working with someone who's got a ton of experience. in understanding the types of attack vectors that fraudsters are going to be using. It is critical for you to implement a solution that is not just looking at one or two risk signals. You have to have a layered risk mitigation solution in place. So it's not just about the document that you're using or the ID that you're using. What device are you using to capture the document? What about the name, address information that's on the document? Is there any criminal records tied to this individual? What about the address itself? Is this a real address? I mean, fraudsters are a sophisticated lot. They know how to go manipulate information. It's a cat and mouse game. It's like Tom and Jerry, right? You're constantly trying to stay ahead of them. You build a wall, they find a taller ladder, right? So if you want to keep up with this, you want to make sure that you're using a solution that provides you multiple layers, a solution that can quickly allow you to configure, calibrate, and tune the offering, and be responsive to unexpected attacks. Because as soon as you put the controls in place, the fraudsters are going to go, well, these guys are using a lot of good controls, so I'm going to go attack someone else who doesn't have those controls. Or they may go, this is still a good place for me to continue my attacks because maybe they're making some good money off it. And so they'll intensify their attacks. And so it's critical that you have a solution that is that can be enhanced, extended rapidly in response to these types of attacks. Ultimately, I think there's another important aspect to think about. As you start putting these types of controls in place, you are impacting good consumers as well. The more layers of defense you put in, the more friction you start introducing to the good people. An analogy that I like to use is what type of experience do you want to provide your good customers? I personally, when I used to travel, I haven't traveled in the last 18 months. I don't know how many if either of you have, but I used to travel quite extensively, and I loved my TSA pre experience. I went and got my TSA pre thing, and then after that, I was just breezing through the security lines. So the question is, what type of experience do you want to provide your end consumers? Do you want to give them that TSA pre-like experience, where you're very quickly able to identify the good people and give them that VIP treatment? Or do you want to put them through the more challenging lanes where you have to take your jacket off, take your laptop out of your bag, take your shoes off? So it really comes down to finding the balance in how much of the controls are helping you catch the bad actors and how much of that is proving to be a friction for your good consumers. And finding that you need a system or you need a solution that can adjust the dials appropriately so you're not negatively impacting your good consumers while you try and stop the bad actors.
Hey, Bala, I'm wondering what your experience from the customers you've worked with, do they typically do the identity verification upfront and never require that person to go back and do it again? Or is there like a refresh process for the identity verification? Is that usually something that needs to be done? Are you tracking any like expiration dates on the identity that they use? In other words, like the expiration on a driver's license, or is it more of like a business process?
To some degree, it's a business process, but it varies by customers. It varies by verticals. It also varies by how the consumer is interacting with your sites. If a consumer is regularly coming in the door, you start establishing a pattern of behavior associated with that individual. The first time you've established them, you want to make sure you're putting all the stringent checks. You've got the ID, you scan the ID, you establish the association with the devices, their addresses, etc. But once they have established themselves, you don't want to keep putting them through the same friction unless you see some different behavior from them. If they get a new device, you may want to introduce a little bit of friction to confirm, verify, validate that it is still the same individual, right? But other than that, I would say just let them run through. As long as they get the credentials in, their login, you got your basic controls in place, whether it's two-factor authentication, etc. But once they're in, let them navigate through. If they try to change their address on their profile, if they try to change their phone number on the profile. Those are instances where you want to step up your authentication, because oftentimes fraudsters, if they're able to get in, either through social engineering or other means, they'll try to change the address on file. 5 minutes later, they'll call into the call center and request for a new credit card. Where do you think that credit card is going to go? So it's important for you to figure out when step-up authentication is required and employ those methods, tools in those instances. We do provide what we call our authentication service. So when you're onboarded using your ID, there's a selfie that goes along with it as well. So when you get to a point where you're trying to make some of these major changes, like changing your account number, your address or your phone number, do a quick selfie. Folks are very much used to taking selfies these days, so it's not seen as too much friction. Take a quick selfie and it's still the same individual, check, and then you go on to the next step in the process. So it's all about finding the right use cases and employing these tools as required. It also depends on the customers as well. If they are frequent, regular customers, you don't want to be harassing them. But if someone's not been interacting with your site for 3 weeks, 2 months, when they come back in, you want to make sure that there's a little friction to confirm that they are who they are.
I feel like I've definitely run into some identity verification situations. And one of the things that jumps out at me was as having been a challenge. I think, doing it on your phone, taking selfies with your phone and lining it up like a camera works really well. And where I've run into issues where it seemed like it didn't work very well, and I'm going back, several years since I remember this happening, but using my laptop camera where I had to take a picture of my driver's license with my laptop camera, and then with, having a kind of the selfie experience, and then saying it doesn't match. It's like, oh my goodness, what am I, So I guess it's somewhat technology dependent, because my guess is, well, first off, holding the license absolutely still in front of a laptop camera versus putting it on the table and moving your phone over it, those are two different things. But I also think that the laptop camera is probably much lower quality, and I would imagine that all of this is very much dependent on the level of technology that user has.
I feel like that's what I was thinking, is it's a technology issue. The best camera most people have in their life is probably their phone. And it's probably been that way for most people for the last 5, 6, 7, maybe even 10 years, depending on, what your camera situation is at home. And I feel like that is certainly the case. I'm looking right now at the video that we're sharing just internally here, and I see you guys both on 720p and probably a MacBook, because MacBooks really don't have very good cameras. As much as I love Macs and that kind of stuff, it isn't a high quality thing. But I'm curious, Bala, what is your perspective? Because I think Jim asked a very interesting question of how has technology improved the ability to do more accurate identity proofing scenarios?
Well, I wish there were high resolution cameras everywhere, but that's not the case, as you rightly pointed out. So it becomes necessary for companies like us to try and figure out how we can do the best with what we have. So you're absolutely right, Jim. When you think about a few years ago, taking a picture with your webcam was not very useful. A lot of blur, poor picture quality. But we made a ton of investments in the space now, because we have seen quite a few of these samples come through, and we have adapted on our end to make the best with what we can get. So our success rates with webcams, pictures now, I would say runs very close to what we see happening through mobile devices as well. So it's definitely gotten much better now. But there is definitely a technology challenge. So in some regions, we do see where they have lower bandwidth than what we have here in the US. We do see, because of the bandwidth challenges, it takes a bit of time for them to go through the process and the image getting uploaded, etc. And so we continuously keep monitoring, we keep checking our data, we check to see where we have some of these drop-offs, and then we start employing right corrections to make sure that we can address those. Ultimately, it's important for us to reduce the abandonment rate as much as possible of good customers. It's critical to, it's always about that end consumer experience. and we need to make all the investments we can to reduce that abandonment rate so they can have quick, easy passage, while our customers, enterprises, have high degree of confidence in those individuals.
So I'm curious, Bala, as technology has matured, one of the things that I am deeply fascinated about, and if you've listened to prior episodes, is deep fakes and how this is affecting the identity space. How is Jumio and other organizations in this space of identity proofing looking at deep fakes, whether it's video or even still pictures, right? How do you stay ahead of that rapidly iterating space?
Great question. We run into this more often than we like. We do have instances where fraudsters are trying to make their way through. We have partnered with great companies. We recently announced a partnership with iProve. iProve provides an excellent liveness detection capability. And with the technology that they bring to bear, with the assets that we have together, we have a really good way of identifying still images. We have a really good way of identifying deep fakes. I would be lying if I said we catch all of them, right? But we've done a pretty decent job, and I've seen so many instances where we see the aftermath of a transaction, and we're like, why did this get rejected? And as you dig in, you go, well, it's not really a selfie. They try to upload an image. Or there've been instances where I've actually seen someone trying to take a selfie with a mask on. And then, of course, the deepfakes, right? So I'd say the technology is getting better over time in identifying these types of instances and weeding them out of the system. Not 100% foolproof, but it's definitely much better than what it was even 3-6 months ago.
Yeah, I feel it's definitely kind of an arms race, right? Between it's getting better, faster, easier to create them. But at the same time, you've got companies who are getting better, faster, more accurate in being able to detect them, which is interesting. I know you've been really generous with your time, so we're going to start to wrap things up here. But Jumio is a very interesting name. I guess what does it mean?
We've been around for quite a bit. Jumio stands for Just Use My ID Online. Jumio. Just Use My ID Online.
I love a clever name, and that's definitely one of the ones that I certainly is ranking top of mind off the top of my head here. That's a great name. I don't think there's any follow up on that one. Jim, I know we've been starting to ask some of the questions around maybe not identity before we start to close things out, but what do we have for this week?
Yeah, I've got another fun question. So we met earlier this week, Bala. You mentioned that you were possibly having an addition to the family, which was of the puppy variety. And so it got me thinking around this question, which is if you had the opportunity to be an animal, any animal other than a human being, that is, because human beings are animals, but if you could be any animal other than a human, what would you choose?
I'd actually say easy question because, let me answer it first. It's a monkey. And here's why. As a kid, growing up in India, I heard countless mythology stories and read a lot of them. My favorite character by a far margin was, and still remains, Hanuman. He is the monkey god, and he was Superman before Superman. So I was fascinated with all of his stories, and he was smart, energetic, strong, and someone who was up for any challenge. So I'd like to think that I've kind of modeled myself after him even as a kid. The funny thing is my kids are fascinated with him now as well. So it kind of runs in the family now. So answer to your question, monkey.
That's pretty excellent. So I'll go and then I'll pass it on to Jeff for his answer. But I was kind of stuck between two, right? I really love the ocean, and by far, if I had to choose an ocean-based animal, it's going to be a dolphin. I love how they run in their pack, and they're kind of the superheroes of the sea. But I recently saw a documentary where they were looking at peregrine falcons and their ability to fly at high rates of speed and dive bomb and things like that. Oh my gosh, I think that would be so exhilarating. And plus, those are two animals I think that people just are in awe of. So my final vote is going to go with the falcon, but a close runner-up would be the dolphin.
Love it.
Jeff.
Yeah. So we were talking about this earlier this week, and I asked the question, does it have to be a real animal? So I'm going to go with, sure, it can be anything you want. I'm not going to pick something that is, run-of-the-mill fantasy like a unicorn or a narwhal or, things like that. I'm going to go very specific, okay? So my video game friends out there who play World of Warcraft will know this. I would be a druid from World of Warcraft. And here's why. Because it can shapeshift into a number of different animal types in addition to a humanoid, and is very flexible and can kind of fill any role out there. And I feel like that's how I am in the real world, where I don't really have, I'm not a Mac guy or a PC guy. I use both. I'll use whatever's the best tool for the job. So I'm going to go a World of Warcraft druid and plead my case before Judge Jim if he'll accept that answer.
Answer accepted, because I think that just shows everybody in the world, or at least our listeners, this is Jeff's true personality. Right? I mean, he took the question and then moved it into the sci-fi world, and that's fantastic.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for accepting my answer, Judge Jim. We're going to go ahead and close it out for this week. But before we do, I want to pass it around just one more time to Bala and to Jim. And then, what are some final words of wisdom or advice that you can give people who are listening here, whether it's on identity proofing or maybe something else identity related or whatever you think is important for folks to hear. Bala, why don't you go first?
Sure thing. Think customers first, your end consumers. Make sure that you're giving them the best experience that they can get. Make sure that you're reducing the friction, as much friction as you can, because each and every one of us go through this process at one point in time or the other. And I tell my kids all the time, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So it's very critical that we build solutions, not just because it's technically great, but because it also provides good level of positive experience for the good consumers while you're effectively stopping the bad actors. So that's my 2 cents at the end of this podcast. Thank you so much for having me on the call. It's been a great conversation today afternoon.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. And let's pass it over to Jim. What about you? Any final thoughts for this week?
I'm going to harken back to our news announcement at the beginning of the show about the conference coming up. I'm obviously excited for conferences coming back, but I would encourage folks that, hey, there are these calls for speakers and opportunities to get out there and share your knowledge. I mean, look, Jeff and I are just regular folks, and we get on and we do this. I mean, I consider this public speaking. We do this every week, and we share our knowledge, and we bring guests on who share their knowledge. And you have knowledge too, and I think it would be great if you can get out there and share it. If you have a fear of public speaking, that's very understandable. But sometimes you just have to take on those fears. I mean, personally, I think everybody deals with that at some level. What I found is if you rehearse your presentation 1,000,000 times, that million and first time that you go to deliver it, it's going to sound good, and you're going to feel confident in what you have to say. So my recommendation is, even if that Authenticate conference isn't the right one, think about getting out there and telling your story and take on, public speaking.
There is plenty of room in the sea for other dolphins to join Jim's pod when it comes to the identity space. So I think I'll bring it home with that one. So thank you so much, Bala, for joining us. Appreciate it. Jim, always thanks for your time. You can connect with Bala on LinkedIn. You can learn more about Jumio at Jumio, Jumio.com, and we'll have links to both of those endeavors in the show notes, as well as a link for AuthenticateCon later this year. You can also visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com. You can maybe follow us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And if you like what you heard, please share it with your friends or enemies. I don't care who you share it with, as long as you share it. Other folks in the identity space, we continue to grow, and that helps us get great guests. And, we're trying to put out the best informational, safe place for identity that we can think of that is, free of distraction from, the sales and marketing BS that we're all kind of hit from on a daily basis. So we're trying to keep it safe, and the more that we can share it with folks that idea, hopefully they'll listen. So with that, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.